Should the US and China have some cooperation when it comes to space activities? Elon Musk tweeted in September that he thinks that this would be a good thing. And this brings up a good point, and this video was actually suggested to me by a viewer. Since 2003, when China's Space Administration placed a man in orbit, China has been pursuing an aggressive program to become the leader in exploring outer space. This has led to several accomplishments, including building the world's largest radio telescope, dubbed FAST, in 2020. They're also creating a space station that is comparable to the ISS. They had the first soft landing on the far side of the moon in 2019. They've also collected and returned to Earth samples from the moon's surface in 2020. And they're sending a rover to Mars that conducts experiments and sends back panoramic high-definition photos. And within the next 10 years, China is promising a lot more, including creating their own satellite constellation for communication. They also plan to return samples from the surface of Mars for scientific study. They would like to have a human moon landing and a permanent station on the moon. They're also planning on launching the world's largest space telescope in a few years, and they want to have exploratory missions to asteroids Jupiter and Uranus. To find out a little bit more about the current state of Chinese space and also what we could see more of in the future, I wanted to reach out to some experts in this episode of Ellie in Space.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hey everyone, this is another viewer requested video, and this time I'm talking to the co-hosts of the Dongfang Hour, Blaine and John. And first I wanted to ask them to describe in their words a little bit about their channel and their background.
First of all, thanks for having us on your channel. It's a real pleasure here to talk to a public that's generally not necessarily interested in Chinese space. So thanks for the invitation. The Dongfang Hour basically is a YouTube channel that aims at increasing awareness on what's going on in the Chinese space sector. This is a channel that we've had going on for a year and a half approximately now. And basically, initially, the idea was that we realized with Blaine that there wasn't really a lot of quality coverage in English of what was going on in the Chinese space sector. Or sometimes there was ideological bias, and just a lot of the resources in the Chinese space sector are in Chinese. They're not in English. And as Blaine and I, we're both speakers of Mandarin, and we can read and write Chinese. This is something that we wanted to cover. So that's initially what the Dongfang Hour was, a YouTube channel. Now we've actually managed to create a website. We write a few articles. We have a weekly newsletter. We have, we also have an audio podcast. So anything Chinese space, basically, is what the Dongfang Hour is. So I'm Jean Deville. I'm one of the two co-hosts, and basically I'm based in Paris. Dongfang Hour is more of a side thing for me. Chinese space is sort of a hobby. My daytime job is not really related to Chinese space.
Just to give a little bit more context from my side, so I'm Blaine Curcio. I'm the other co-host of the Dongfang Hour. And I guess to follow on John's point, I'll give a little bit of background of kind of myself and my coverage of the Chinese space sector, and then how I got into Dongfang Hour. So I've lived in sort of greater China area for most of the past 12 years, about half of which was in mainland China and the other half primarily in Hong Kong. And I've been covering for most of that time the global satellite communications sector, which is kind of a subset of the global space industry. And so about 5 years ago, we started to see a lot more commercial space companies being established in China. We started to see a lot more government support, and really just this very rapid evolution of what was at that time a really, really nascent commercial space sector. And so at that time, I started my own company in Hong Kong and started focusing quite primarily on the Chinese space sector, so broadening my scope from SATCOM to space, and then kind of narrowing it from global to China. And through that work and through that continued coverage, we started to find more interest from companies and from people, and just sort of learning more about the Chinese space sector. And to Sean's point, I think our combined time spent in China, really being on the ground and understanding, I think, a lot of the cultural nuance and just other elements of context that need to be conveyed in order to really understand what's going on in the space sector. I think this gives us I guess, a unique perspective, you could say, on the topic.
It seems the Chinese space program is underrepresented in Western media, so I wanted to ask them what's going on right now with Chinese space.
So maybe I can give a little bit of context on like the broader Chinese space program and space sector and kind of where we've been up to the last couple of years, and then maybe Jean can kind of dig in a little bit more to the last few years, and then we can kind of go from there. Yeah, because I think to your earlier point, has China been here all along, and we're just really kind of noticing it now? I think that is to a certain extent the case, in the sense that when you look at some of the things that China has done over the last, say, 20 years. They put their first human in space in the early 2000s. I think 2003, if my memory is serving me correctly. So they've been doing lunar missions for more than a decade, and I think that space more generally has been on the sort of increasing in popularity around the world, whether it's in China or in the West. And so I think that the programs are getting bigger and the ambitions are getting bigger, and that's causing more people to pay attention. And in China, that's the sort of well-defined plans that have been in existence sort of even before space became more popular, those are starting to come to fruition. And I think those are really kind of independent of this increasing popularity of space. But then I do think you have a lot of other things that are happening more recently that are more a result of things like SpaceX or other, developments in the West. So for example, the kind of commercialization of space that we've seen over the last handful of years, I think that was not really so well planned, say 10 or 15 years ago. But if we look at things like a long-term Chinese space station that we're seeing now that's getting a lot of attention, that's been planned since, the early 2000s. So I think there's this sort of, a lot of it has been hidden in plain sight if you read, sort of the medium to long-term development plans of China. But a lot of it has been a little bit more spontaneous. And I was speaking with Jean earlier about, this idea of, some of the evolutions that we've seen in terms of commercialization of certain types of the sector, they were just inconceivable as recently as like 10 years ago. So, I kind of went through a couple of different points there, but John, anything to add from your side on any of those points?
Well, it's interesting you asked the question. I mean, we're just wrapping up a video on the top 8 to 10 events of the Chinese space sector in 2021, and it's amazing how so much is happening now in just one single year, as compared to the Chinese space sector 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. And just to give a few figures, so your viewers can get an idea of what's going on. China, at the time of recording, has launched 53 rockets in 2021, and that represents about 31 to 32% of all launches worldwide this year. And this can be compared to, for example, 45 for the U.S. The U.S. definitely has been launching a lot of satellites as well. So 45 launches. This includes all the launches that have been putting Starlink's satellites into orbit. So 53 launches. There have been a lot of high-profile launches this year. They've started to deploy their Chinese space station into orbit. There have been also many high-profile missions sending taikonauts to the Chinese space station. There have been cargo missions. Last year, there was the Mars Tianwen-1 mission that was launched. So really a lot of things going on also in Earth observation, in sat-nav, in communications, lots of different payloads. And so China's deploying them at a very rapid pace. Although I would note, and maybe going back to one of Blaine's points, is a lot of this is part of the national program. It's state-owned companies doing this. So there has been some commercial activity building up in China, but it still represents a very small ecosystem. And so out of the 43 launches, it's I haven't counted them exactly, but it's definitely less than 10 launches out of the 53.
I also asked them to tell us more about the Chinese telescope that's supposed to launch in 2024.
China is rather new to space-based astronomy. They don't currently have a space telescope, but however, on the ground, they have a number of quite extensive optical network of telescopes, as well as large radio telescopes. You may have heard of the FAST telescope in the province of Guizhou, which is absolutely huge. And the telescope that you were referring to just now is a telescope that will indeed be launched in 2024. And it is a little bit similar to Hubble, definitely, with a slightly wider field of view. And the ingenuity of this telescope is that it will be evolving in the vicinity of the Chinese space station. And so basically that means that it'll be easier to service. So if repairs need to be done, it basically docks the Chinese space station, and Chinese astronauts are able to make the repairs, and then it undocks, and then off it goes to take pictures of space.
Okay, this is what I think is a really good and possibly difficult question to answer. We just won't know until it happens, but who do they think is going to get humans on Mars first?
So yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's hard to say. Maybe you can start with some background on what China has been doing with Mars. So China has much less experience than the U.S. And other more traditional spacefaring nations with regards to Mars. The Tianwen-1 mission that was launched by China last year was China's first independent mission to Mars, and it was basically an orbiter, it was a lander, and it was a rover. And so the U.S. has been doing this for decades and decades, right? So on paper, you'd think that China is sort of really in a catch-up phase, but what the advantage that China has is that it has what we can call the latecomers advantage. So basically, you're coming decades after everyone, but you're able to learn from the various mistakes that everyone has made, the US, the USSR, and Europe. And so they managed to package in the Tianwen-1 mission, as mentioned, an orbiter, a lander, and a rover. And these were things that were sort of done over separate missions by NASA, by ESA, by Russia. And so I think what Tianwen-1 represents today is a catch-up phase for China, but their next mission to Mars, which will likely be called Tianwen-2, aims at the end of the decade at bringing samples back from Mars to Earth. And this is something that NASA and ESA are also planning for the end of the decade. So we're seeing, China's timelines cross a little bit with what's being done by Western spacefaring nations. So I think that's very exciting. China is also, to reach Mars, China is going to need much larger rockets. And in that regard, I think definitely the U.S. has a little bit of advance there with SLS and with, Starship. Definitely that is something that China also needs. They're working on. They have a rocket that's called the Long March 9, which mostly exists only on paper right now. It's under development, but they're aiming to, have a rocket ready only by around 2030. So, if Elon Musk manages to keep its timeline of having, Starship available in the next, I don't know exactly the dates, but probably the next 5 years. Definitely, I think the U.S. will get to Mars first if we're talking about slowly building a human settlement, or building blocks to reach that goal. But otherwise, China should be looking towards that goal around the late 2030s if we're talking about a human presence, according to various timelines that they have shown.
I also wanted to know where Chinese space is right now with rocket reusability and if that's even a priority.
So initially it wasn't a priority for the Chinese. When you look at, so today when we look at Chinese launch is still mainly the national rockets, the Long March rockets. So you have the Long March 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and in the future 9. And none of these are reusable today. They were always designed to be expendable rockets. Now, of course, China looks very attentively at what's going on in the US, and definitely how SpaceX has managed to bring the cost of launch down with reusability. And we're starting to see some plans to make some of these state-owned rockets reusable. We saw, for example, that China has plans to make their Long March 8 reusable in a quite a similar way, where it's vertical takeoff, vertical landing. Although the landing for the Long March 8 would be to have the first stage and the boosters land together, but I guess that's more of a detail. So that's the story for state-owned rockets. They don't have a long history in trying to make things reusable, but we're starting to see them aim at that now. However, when we're talking about the private companies, the commercial companies that have been set up over the past 5 years, it's a completely a different story. We've seen, so there have been since 2014, since basically China has authorized private capital to invest into the the launch sector. We've seen 15 to 20 launch companies be set up in China, and they're still very small, but almost all of them have aimed at having a medium lift reusable rocket, and all of them are doing it really following SpaceX's footsteps, especially the Falcon 9. And you see, I mean, SpaceX is clearly the model. You even have a rocket like a company like Galactic Energy that calls their engine their Kerlox engines the Merlin engine of China. They call their rockets, the Falcon 9 of China. So really, the commercial companies have been trying to follow what Elon Musk has been doing with SpaceX, in a nutshell.
Not a lot from my side on rocket reusability. That was a pretty comprehensive break. I guess one thing that maybe is sort of related to rocket reusability a little bit in terms of just the depth of the supply chain in China, where you have now, to Jean's point, 15 or 20 commercial launch companies, such to the extent that there's now like 2 or 3 or 4 companies that are focused only on developing specific types of engines for other rocket companies. So you just have so much, I guess, competition, as it were, among these sort of small to medium sized launch players that are it leads to just this large number of companies.
There's another company also. I guess this is maybe a slight difference with the US ecosystem. You have some of the companies also looking at developing space planes. So using the generation of lift through having, possibly wings, for example, but not necessarily wings, lift generating spacecraft to enable reusability rather than doing vertical landing. So there's a couple of companies. There's not a big number of them, but space transportation, iSpace. Some of these companies are planning to do things a little bit differently as well.
I guess one other, again, very tangentially related point that I think is a difference with the U.S., but we're starting to see change a little bit, is this idea of space tourism and using some of this technology that can be used for both, say, rockets to orbit and also suborbital or orbital space tourism. And we've talked about how in China, up until 6 or 12 months ago, there was not a lot of public interest by wealthy people or by commercial space companies in space tourism, and I think one of the reasons is that sort of ostentatious wealth is not so politically easy to do that nowadays. It's not a particularly people don't like being so high profile with their wealth, I guess. But we've seen now over the last 6 to 12 months, a couple of commercial companies doing much more kind of space tourism focused research and development into things like a Chinese New Shepard type of launch vehicle. And also we've seen, I guess, just this past week, a Chinese cryptocurrency multimillionaire who purchased a Blue Origin New Shepard flight and is doing a sort of space tourist flight in 2022. So I think that's another thing to keep an eye on in terms of different launch technologies. To what extent is space tourism allowed to develop, and sort of how does that work as a supporting sector to launch?
If you're enjoying this video and the Ellie in Space channel, consider checking out my sponsor of today's video, Brilliant. I have started taking lessons on Brilliant, and I really love how you can learn interactively. In fact, the best way to learn anything is by doing it yourself. Interactive learning helps you learn 6 times more effectively than watching lecture videos. No surprise there. And anyone can start. Brilliant has lots of great courses for all abilities and knowledge levels. So you'll find something that interests you, especially if you are interested in the Ellie in Space channel and the topics that I talk about on a weekly basis. Luckily for you, you can get started for free. Join millions of people already learning on Brilliant with a special offer just for you. Head to brilliant.org/EllieInSpace to get started for free with the interactive lessons, and the first 200 listeners will also get 20% off an annual membership. Pretty cool. Beijing recently accused the US of unsafe conduct over 2 close calls with Starlink satellites and the Chinese space station. So I wanted to ask them what their thoughts are about this.
Yeah, so that's very recent news. It dates from today. I haven't found the time yet to look really into it, but it seems that it's going to go into a PR war where basically, the Chinese are going to criticize the management of Starlink satellites in low Earth orbit. But there is a little bit of hypocrisy there, because, Russia was it a couple of weeks ago, did an anti-satellite test and putting satellite debris all over low Earth orbit. And the Chinese were very silent on that, although some of the debris were intercepting the Chinese space station trajectory. So I guess that we're in a situation today where everyone, the US, Russia, China, I don't know that much, but definitely China and the US and Europe with the ISS and the Chinese space station in orbit are very concerned with all the debris that's in orbit. And there's just this sort of a PR confrontation of, sort of criticizing your enemies, but being silent over what your friends are doing that's going on.
Just a couple of points from my side. I think it'll be interesting to watch China's, to what extent do they pursue this with Starlink, because ultimately China is also planning a similarly large constellation to Starlink based on their ITU filings. And so eventually there's going to likely be a similar risk of collision being created by hundreds or thousands of Chinese satellites being launched into low Earth orbit. And I mean, you're already seeing now, obviously different order of magnitude, but you're seeing, more than 100 Chinese satellites easily launched into low Earth orbit every year, which would put them at, number 2, second to the US and Starlink. Well, actually, I guess OneWeb maybe would launch more in terms of the number of satellites, but digressing. It'll be interesting to see, how far does China want to take this, because eventually being, not that far from now, they're going to be an equally large or at least similarly large player in low Earth orbit in terms of the amount of stuff that they're launching.
And, another example of how they've been doing PR regarding space debris. I think it was last year they launched Long March 5B that was putting into orbit. I don't exactly remember what the launch was about, but basically the first stage came back and it was an uncontrolled reentry. And Long March 5B is a huge rocket, and there's a lot of criticism. I believe was it Senator Nelson, or at least someone from NASA, had issued a formal criticism of what was done. And so, I mean, the following launches of large rockets, normally I think the Long March 7s, for example, there's been much more transparency with what's going on with the reentry of the first stages, and much more attention that's being put into performing controlled reentry. So I think things are changing, and I guess the criticisms that are going back and forth, this is also something to encourage all parties to sort of pay attention to more to what is being done regarding space debris and reentry of rocket first stages.
It's been basically impossible for NASA to have any engagement with Chinese space since the Wolf Amendment in 2011. So I wanted to ask Blaine and John if they see that changing anytime soon.
But then prior to that, there have also been other events that have sort of degraded the level of cooperation that you've seen. So, I mean, if we go back to, say, the early to mid 90s, you actually used to see, U.S. satellites being launched on Chinese rockets as a source of reasonably cheap and reasonably reliable access to space. So Iridium, which is a big global low Earth orbit, kind of like a precursor to Starlink, although now they have a new generation, which are quite capable satellites. But they've been around for 25 years. And their first generation, which was launched around the late 90s, early 2000s, a couple of their launches were on Long March rockets. So this was American satellites that were, at the time, I guess Motorola was the company that was mostly financially backing this. So there was quite some commercial cooperation in a pretty transactional way, and with some restrictions on intellectual property transfer, but nonetheless, pretty good-natured, good-willed commercial transactions between these two countries. But then there was a launch failure where a Chinese rocket was carrying a geostationary satellite, and it crashed shortly after liftoff. And basically, parts of the satellite were taken and kind of allegedly examined and then put back together and given back to the U.S. And there was this concern that there had been this unwilling and illegal transfer of intellectual property due to this rocket having failed to launch the satellite into orbit. And so after that, it became pretty much impossible for U.S. satellites to be launched on Chinese rockets, and subsequent cooperation became more difficult. And then 2011 would have been the Wolf Amendment, which I don't know the full background of that beyond the fact that it is it's a rather clear bill that prevents prevents collaboration between NASA and Chinese counterparts. But yeah, Jean, anything to add on your side on?
Yeah, I think probably the major event was really what happened in the 90s, and what followed is the ITAR regulation, right, which prevents basically any major U.S. component, satellite linked to satellites or to launch vehicles, to be exported, to be sold to the Chinese. And since any U.S. system and also just European systems tend to always have some bit of an American component in them, this basically decoupled the Chinese space sector from the international markets. And this is why when you look at, I was speaking to someone from the Chinese space industry, which basically said that, in the Chinese space industry, over 95% of all the components are sourced locally, because it's not just that they want to buy a local, but it's because they have to, and there are regulations, U.S. regulations, that prevent foreign manufacturers from really selling parts into China.
And furthering this question, will we have to see change? This is something that I asked Harvard astrophysicist and astronomer Jonathan McDowell a few months ago, and he says that ideally we would like to have more cooperation. It's just so unclear if that's gonna ever happen.
I think ideally there would be more cooperation between the US and China, just being the two kind of leading space powers at this point. But I don't see it changing substantially in the sort of, moving forward. I mean, basically, I think there's a couple of issues, but the biggest issue is that it's very hard to imagine the U.S. and China cooperating in a way where neither one of those countries will be the junior partner in a cooperation between the two of them. And so it's just really hard to imagine there being any substantive cooperation. I think that what you're going to start to see, which will be, it leads a little bit more optimism, is more established Western space powers cooperating with China, as China is spearheading these very big projects that, let's say, no individual European country could do on their own. So, for example, having the Chinese space station, and as that becomes larger and more sophisticated, you're going to have more impetus for European countries to collaborate with China. And you're starting to see that now in human spaceflight. And I think that could serve as a sort of a bridge that serves as kind of it mitigates to a certain extent the risk of China really just kind of being in its own world and really doing things on its own entirely, which I think, again, is not a desirable outcome. We don't want to have these two very separate camps, I don't think. But yeah, I think it's hard to imagine there being very significant collaboration between China and the US, even if it's going to become more opportunities for China and the West to collaborate.
And we've seen in the past, the U.S. and Russia are working together in the ISS, right? Even though both countries have rather adversarial relationships, we can be friends in space. That was the approach, right? Friends in space and maybe adversaries on the ground. But we've seen that this is not something that has materialized between the U.S. and China. The U.S. wants to keep China out of the ISS. And we're seeing increasingly the same thing happen for deep space exploration. For example, there's the Artemis program, there's the Artemis Accords. There are a lot of countries that are taking part in this U.S.-led lunar exploration program. And on the other hand, China and Russia have announced the ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, which is very similar to the Artemis program, but this time China and Russia led. And so this is a very recent program. It was announced just a couple of months ago, but very likely they are going to try and attract partners into that. So we're going to see, it seems like we're increasingly seeing two sides build up even in space. And that definitely is not a positive development.
I also wanted to talk about space weaponization and the militarization of space, and if this is a growing concern for them.
Well, you want to take that one, or
I can start. It's always a fun topic. So I think in terms of, there are some reasons to be a little bit optimistic as China becomes more powerful in its space capabilities, in the sense that it creates. It makes higher stakes for it creates higher stakes for if conflict does arise. So I guess it creates kind of a stronger deterrent. So a couple of things that would come to mind: China having a more global network of TT&C, so tracking telemetry and command stations. So basically ground stations with which it can track its satellites, but also track certain other objects in space. And having these systems more globally, it gives them kind of a bit more intel over what threats exist to China's interest in the West. And so I guess to a certain extent, again, it creates more defense, but for China, which creates kind of a stronger deterrent, I guess, for conflict. That being said, I think you're also going to see China kind of developing certain technologies that could be dual use or that are dual use. And some of them are areas where China's really, if not world leading, like close to world leading. Like, for example, quantum communications via satellite. They have a really, quite sophisticated and large program that's devoted to that. So yeah, I think it's, I don't know, similar to kind of cooperation with the U.S. I don't think things are going to get considerably better anytime soon, but I do think that the kind of more balance between the two countries in terms of capabilities, it does create some deterrent, I guess. Yeah.
And when we're talking about the militarization of space, and we're talking about China, you often hear two stories, right? You have especially from maybe some more conservative, U.S. politicians, you hear that China is militarizing everything, and there is sometimes a little bit of hype regarding what China is doing in space, often because there's not enough information out there on what China is doing. And so, the reflex is everything is military. And then you have the other little voice coming from China saying, we do think, we're looking for peace. We're doing things peacefully. And naturally, I mean, the truth is somewhat in the middle, right? And so it is undeniable that China is developing space weapons. They're developing hypersonic glide vehicles, missiles. They're developing, they have a range of ballistic missiles with nuclear capability. They have developed anti-satellite weapons. There was a test in 2007, notably. But, to take a step back, these are also technologies that other big space powers are doing, such as the U.S., such as Russia. All of these technologies that I just mentioned are being developed by other countries. So I think there needs to be a little bit of people need to calm down a little bit when they look into what the Chinese what the Chinese are doing in space. And just to give you an example, on the core module of the Chinese space station that's currently in space, there's a robotic arm, and this is used to help astronauts when they are doing spacewalks and doing some of their tasks, and it can also help incoming spacecraft docked. And this was accused by some part of the U.S. military establishment of being a weapon, although there is almost exactly the same arm on the ISS, right, called the Canadarm2. And so there's sometimes there's just a lot of hype that's going on what, on the military nature of what China is doing. But of course, I think it's important not to be naive either. I think that if we look at space from the Chinese standpoint, I think it's also interesting to put into some historical perspective, which is that today I believe that China looks at its current geopolitical situation on Earth, and it has some tensions with neighboring countries in the South China Sea. There's notably territorial claims and disputes with neighboring countries. And China's understanding is that this is to a large extent due to the fact that China was weak in the 19th century and was not there during this land grab phase where Western powers were able to secure pieces of land, across all the oceans. And there's this very famous phrase of this very high-ranking official, space industry official in China, saying that the universe is like the ocean, and the moon is like the Diaoyu Islands. The Diaoyu Islands being one of the pieces of land that Japan and China are fighting over. And they're saying basically, if we don't go to space now, others will do it, and future space assets will be locked up, and we will be deprived of space assets. So that's their point of view. There's a very strong historical background to their way of seeing things today. I think that's really important to keep in mind.
And last but not least, I asked them to elaborate about the Chinese version of Starlink.
China has over the last several years been actively developing its own versions of Starlink, and it's been interesting to look at how that has evolved as Starlink has evolved. And so just a very little bit of recent historical context. I mean, we first started seeing these new low Earth orbit satellite constellations coming into the market in around like 2015. These plans started coming out with OneWeb and with Starlink and a couple of others. And the original iteration was some, few hundred satellites in low Earth orbit providing broadband. And China, around that time, 2016, 2017, 2018, they started announcing their own similar constellations of, a few hundred satellites providing broadband internet. And then around 2018, 2019, and certainly beginning of 2020, Starlink really started accelerating their launch pace. So it was around end of 2019, they started doing 60 satellites every 2 weeks. And it became really clear that they were going to launch thousands of satellites and eventually tens of thousands of satellites. And so right around that time, so it would have been like early 2020, China started to accelerate its what they would call reforms in the satellite manufacturing sector. So this is a historically quite state-owned sector, companies that build communication satellites. And so you then started seeing a lot more commercial companies that had originally planned to have their own constellation similar to Starlink, but much smaller scale, pivot and start building satellites or trying to build satellites for what was implicitly going to be a big state-owned constellation. And just a little bit more context, I mean, when we think about China in terms of telecommunications, that's a very state-owned sector, right? The big three telcos in China are all 100% state-owned. I mean, they have tight control of the internet. It's just a very sensitive part of the economy. And so, again, you had companies that had previously thought about doing their own global Starlink-type constellation that pivoted towards building satellites for a state-owned constellation, basically a state-owned internet service provider from space. And so then we saw at the beginning of 2021, a new company created called China Satellite Networks Limited, state-owned company at a very high level of the sort of state-owned hierarchy, that's going to be tasked with deploying a sort of Chinese response to Starlink, if we can call it that. And we don't have a firm number of satellites. We don't have a very clear timeline at the moment, but we did see at the end of last year, China going to the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and filing for a couple of constellations of some, 10 or 12,000 satellites for low Earth orbit broadband internet. So we expect a kind of Starlink-like constellation in terms of scale, probably in the next 5 to 7 years. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that kind of overlays with China's broader kind of digital Silk Road initiative and this kind of rollout of different Chinese technology, whether it's mobile networks or smartphones or the apps themselves on the smartphones. And again, sort of having a satellite internet overlay on all of that is going to be quite interesting to watch. One other point I would highlight that's quite different between the US and China in that context is I think SpaceX and Starlink, they quite actively are able to work with the government entities that are overseeing whatever they're doing. So for SpaceX, it will be like NASA or the US military, they're providing launches to these clients. And with Starlink, it's like the FTC, I guess, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, where, Starlink, they got some decent government subsidies for providing internet access to rural areas. And I think in China, there's certainly not nearly such an active relationship between the Chinese version of NASA and any company that wants to be like a Chinese version of SpaceX. So like the CNSA is not, they're not as big. They don't have as much, in terms of they don't contract as much of the project out to suppliers, that kind of thing. So I think there's this big difference in terms of just the sort of the way that these companies can interface with the government. But I think it's more just it's a different system. It's not necessarily, I guess, better, worse, or easier or more difficult. But yeah.
Yeah, we're really very happy that you thought to invite us. For some reason, the YouTube algorithm generally just suggests our video to, I think, a majority of Chinese viewers or viewers from Southeast Asia, which is fine. We definitely appreciate our viewers from that region of the world. Unfortunately, it's not suggesting our viewers to Western viewers, or at least much less. And I'm sure there are a lot of people that are just generally interested in space that would be interested in what's going on in China, despite the confrontational environment that we currently have between the US and China. I think there's still a lot of fun stuff to look at in the Chinese space industry. So I'm really happy to be invited on the channel, and hope this piques up the interest of your viewers for Chinese space.
I really hope that you guys enjoyed today's conversation. I really learned a lot from Blaine and John, and it was really great that we were able to have this discussion. Again, thank you to my Patreon subscriber for even suggesting this. And of course, if you're interested in supporting me on Patreon, that would be very greatly appreciated. I have a lot of exciting stuff planned for 2022, so I hope that you can join in for all of it. All right, see you soon.